Brothers and sisters, good morning to you. Today we read 2 Kings chapter 13, where Pastor Joshua is sharing. It's not an easy chapter. It seems like an easy chapter when we read, but the meaning is deep. I hope I am able to tell it to you. The title for today is At first I thought the prophet died, but God's salvation was still there. That's my first thought. Elisha died. Before that, Elijah died. Does it mean that there was no hope for the northern kingdom? Israel was still in the sin, deep sin. They were unable to come out of the sin of the house of Jeroboam. And then when it comes to the house of Ahab, house of Omri, and then house of Ahab, they were reed in the water, wavering, battering back and forth. And then came to the time of Jehu. Jehu did well, so there will be his fourth generation will still be on the throne. 4 generations of Jehu will be on the throne. And this chapter talked about the descendants of Jehu. Could they survive? They still walk in the sin. So what should God do? What would will Israel be destroyed totally? This chapter tells us no. The answer is no. There is always grace and hope in God. So we put on the setting, the situation, the meaning to the Israelites at that time. But the title I want to use will be applicable to us today, or to the people, applicable to the people in exile, to the people in captivity, and more relevant to us today. So I give another title. Even though in despair, despite despair, God's grace is still there. So we are in darkness, and people are in despair. God's grace is still here. So what is the grace of God? This is what we want to explore in this chapter. But if we just read on the surface, we're unable to tell. We don't know. What impresses us most reading this chapter? So Elisha asked Jehoash to shoot the ground. So he did part of it, but then he didn't do all of it. So 3 times Jehoash defeated the Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael. Most likely we'll focus on this part, but what is meaning? What does it mean to us? To the people in captivity and to us today, what does it mean? Even in darkness and despair, God's grace is still there. That's the encouragement to us today. And it's the message to the people in captivity too. Even though you are in captivity, even though you are in a hardship, even though you are still in sin, God's grace is still there. Coming to this chapter, where we read the stories of kings. So we say that Kings should be divided into 4 chapters, 4 books. So Second Kings is the 4th book. As we read First Kings or Second Samuel, we could see that God was gracious to the house of David. Even to the first part of the Second Kings, the first half of Second Kings, chapter 11, Second Kings, it's also talk about house of Judah. For the sake of David, God does not put out the light, the lamp of David. Even in darkness, the lamp of David did not go out. That's what I read. I share in chapter 11, which I shared last week. Yes, the house of David was in darkness, but the lamp did not go out because God remembered David. God always was gracious towards the southern kingdom. That's why the southern king were not good. The worst part was they intermarried, they make alliance with the house of Ahab. Remember Jehoram, Ahaziah, we were all like, it was really hard. But God still showed grace to the southern kingdom. And the southern kingdom, in comparison, they reigned longer. The southern kingdom, the kings in the southern kingdom reigned longer, all because of the promise of God who was on David. Even though when they were not good, the kings were not good, and even Athaliah killed the whole royal line, all the royal heirs, in order to destroy completely the house of David. It's like house of David was facing to total destruction. House of David was almost totally destroyed. And yet, there was one survivor. That's the King Joash was saved. Okay, you wouldn't know, it's a Chinese story, which Pastor Joshua was mentioning, but it just means that there was like one, the only sole survivor. Okay. Okay, we don't talk about the Chinese history. It just mirror to this, the Chinese history mirror the history that we read in these books. So Jehoash survived, and he was king for 40 years. He did not die. He was not killed by Athaliah. Athaliah almost killed everyone, every royal heirs. But why did Jehoash was able to leave it? Because of the grace of God. The lamp of God did not go out. The lamp of David did not go out because of the grace of God on them. From these 4 books, the message we receive is, yes, God's grace, it was on the house of David. In comparison, the house of Israel, the northern kingdom did not receive grace. They did not receive grace until coming to this chapter, chapter 13. It tells us God still showed grace to the house of Israel. On the surface, the northern kingdom was like reed in the water, being battered. And in comparison, comparatively, the southern kingdom was more stable. But in the 2 Kings chapter 13, it's telling us that both kingdoms were under the grace of God. God showed grace. It also tells the people in captivity as well as us today, how whatever darkness we are in, maybe we are in such darkness just like the house of Israel, the northern kingdom, and yet God's grace is still with us. But whether you are aware of it or not, whether you ask for it or not, the grace of God is always there. Today we should also ask God's grace, and we should see God's grace and see the hand of God. And, for the past 20 years of 611, God sent me to Hong Kong, brought me back to Hong Kong. The grace of God has been on our life. Even in this Hong Kong present situation, God still was gracious to us, has been gracious to us. God is gracious to every church. God is gracious to every Christian. But whether you ask for it or not, do you believe the grace of God? Or you ignore the grace of God? You ignore what God is like, and you take God for nothing. Yes, you say that you believe God, but you take God as nothing. Yes, okay, we wouldn't say, God, you do not exist, but we limit God. We thought that, God, you do not work anymore. That's our belief. Today, we need to take matter into our own hands. I need to fight for my own peace and safety. We don't think that God gives us peace. We do not believe that God will intervene in our society, in our nation. We don't even believe that God will intervene in China today. God will not intervene in the political power in China. But I must tell you all, if we think like that, we do not believe God. Today we see the northern kingdom. God still intervenes. However dark, however despair northern kingdom was, God intervened. Today we should not think that God doesn't exist. During the day of COVID, we do not think that, oh God, you do not exist. Let's read chapter 13 now. It's a contrast, the first part and the last part of this chapter. I will divide this chapter into 3 paragraphs. Verse 1 to 9 is the first paragraph. It tells us the historical background. In the 23rd year of Jehoash, the son of Ahaziah, king of Judah, Jehoahaz, the son of Jehu, became king over Israel in Samaria and reigned 17 years. Now is a time that you have many duplicate similar names. We have 2 Joas in the northern kingdom and in the southern kingdom. And then we have Jehoahaz, we have Jehoahaz, and then we have Joas. So you need to draw like a graph in order to know who is who. King of Israel, the Jehoahaz, the son of Jehu, became king over Israel. There will be 4 generations of Jehu on the throne. Jehu, Jehoahaz, and then it will be Jehoahaz. And at the same time, there is another Jehoahaz in the southern kingdom. Northern kingdom. Jehu Jehoahaz, and then Jehoahaz. Okay, this is Chinese way of remembering it. Sorry, I don't think JJJ. They are just JJJ, right? Oh, Ahab. Okay, we have Ahab, Ahaziah, right? Ahab, Ahaziah, Jehoahaz, and then in the northern kingdom is Jehoahaz. In the northern kingdom, so he was king for 40 years. I tell you a little bit more background. Jehoahaz. So Jehoahaz was quite nothing outstanding about his reign. But then he was king for 40 years. Nothing special to record. He died at the age of 47. That was an early death, I must say. He was king at the age of 7, right? So he was king for 40 years, and then he died. So he was 47 when he died. So die young. He died young. But during his reign of 40-year reign, there were 2 kings in the house of Israel. Joas and then Ahaziah. So 2 of them, 33 years. 2 kings in the northern kingdom. In the time of Jehoahaz, the time of Jehoahaz, the son of Jehu, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Verse 2. God promised Jehu, and yet he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, in the sight of the Lord. In the dark. Verse 3, then the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel, and he delivered them into the hand of Hazael, king of Syria, and in the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael, all their days. They were in sin, so they faced judgment. You see that there was no grace of the grace of God was not there. They were in the northern kingdom, from Jeroboam all the way. Jeroboam, and then Omri, and then Ahab, and then Jehu. That's the northern kingdom. Now they still did evil. So they were still in punishment, in curse, in judgment. But the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel. And then he delivered them into the hands of Hazael and in the hand of Ben-Hadad all their days. So Hazael and Ben-Hadad, the son, father and son. So Jehoahaz faced the fact that he was bullied by Aram all the days. It was a strong oppression. The nations almost destroyed, almost in captivity. So Jehoahaz pleaded with the Lord, and the Lord listened to him. Verse 4, for he saw the oppression of Israel because of the king of Israel oppressed them. So in darkness, just like Ahab, when judgment came, God spoke of the judgment. So immediately Ahab humbled himself and knelt before God. So God gave him grace. Now, Jehu's son did the same thing. He saw the Israel was under oppression. They were unable to overcome Syria. They were bullied. They were oppressed by Syria. Oh, okay, this is the anger of the Lord towards them. So he pleaded with God, to plead with the Lord. And the Lord listened to him and gave him grace. And the Lord gave Israel a deliverer, so that they escaped from under the hand of the Assyrian, and the children of Israel that dwelt in their tents as before. So they were able to dwell in safety. Without this grace of God, they will be in captivity already. in the hand of son of Jehu. They will be in captivity. Then people will be scattered. But because Jehoahaz pleaded with the Lord, so the Lord listened to him and gave them a deliverer. So they did not. They were able to dwell in their tents as before. So who was this a deliverer? In verse 5, who was it? But I think it's Elisha. Because Elisha means the Lord saves, the Lord delivers. But here it doesn't mention about Elisha. Because Elisha was old. We don't know whether it's Elisha for sure, but I think it should be him. If it was Elisha, but the name was not mentioned, we think that his ministry was coming to an end here. Yes, they experienced deliverance, and yet they did not depart from the sins of the house of Jeroboam, the sins of worshipping golden calf. They did not depart. A wooden image also remained in Samaria. Verse 6. They still worship golden calves. They took the golden calves as the Lord. They also worshipped Ashtaroth and Ashtaroth. They worshipped the female god, the goddess and queen of heaven. The king of Syria had destroyed them and made them like the dust at threshing. For he left of the army of Jehoahaz only 50 horsemen, 10 chariots, and 10,000 foot soldiers. It's such a miserable, dark history here. Verse 7. House of Israel in the time of Jehoahaz was really, really weak. They were barely surviving. They were just trying to breathe under the oppression of Syria. So the Syria was able to control how many army you have. So they were defeated. They surrendered totally. The chariots, horsemen, foot soldiers are under restriction. You cannot have more than that. So it's like defense. It's only for self-defense. You are not able to build a strong army. They were unable to have sovereignty, but they were not destroyed yet. Then Jehoahaz rested with his father, and Joash his son reigned in his place. That's the next generation of Jehu. In the 30s, but he did evil in the sight of the Lord and did not depart from the sin of Jeroboam. Continued to worship golden calves. And then Joash also died. And Jeroboam the second reigned. That's the third generation of Jehu, right? The house of Israel did not depart from worshipping idols. It's telling us here they did not depart from worshipping idols. They even worship Queen of Heaven. Then the anger of the Lord was aroused against them. The anger of the Lord starting from Jeroboam all the way until now. After house of Omri, after house of Ahab, after house of Jehu, the anger of the Lord was still there. No, they did not depart from worshipping idols. They even worship more and more idols. Now the house of Israel was so weak that they were at the brink of destruction. Total despair and darkness. the other countries control their finance, control their army, the military force. In that despair, what happened? What to do? We don't know what to do. Not only so, Prophet Elisha was dying. So here it talks about a deliverer, right? Verse 5. And here Elisha, the Lord delivers. In this second paragraph, in the time of Jehoahaz, the country was in darkness. Their deliverer was dying. So Elisha was sick with the illness of which he would die. In the past, they had Elijah. Every time when the Syria was trying to attack house of Israel, then Elisha will report. So Elisha helped the Israel to come out of Aram, deliver them. Now he was dying. So Joash, the king of Israel, came down to him. Oh, my father, the chariots of Israel and their horsemen. We cannot survive without you. They were in such darkness. Elisha was dying. And Elisha said, helped him. Before his death, Elisha helped Joash. So Elisha make effort. And God fulfilled what the prophets said. So Elisha asked Joash to strike the ground with arrows. The arrow of the Lord deliverance towards the east. You must strike the Syrians at Aphek till you have destroyed them. Verse 17. But Joash only struck like 3 times, but not 5 or 6 times. So Elisha says, take the arrows. So he took them and he says, struck the ground. So he struck 3 times and stopped. Verse 18. And the man of God was angry with him and said, you should have struck 4, 5 or 6 times, then you will have struck Syria till you have destroyed it. But now you will strike Syria only 3 times. Such a powerful prophet was dying. Before his death, the prophets did this. And then last paragraph, verse 20 to 25. Elisha died. Here it mentions something very interesting, right? So Elisha died and they buried him, right, in the tomb. He was dead and buried, okay? His book was there in the tomb. So it has been a while. And then time of war, even the raiding band from Moab invaded the land. So Moab invaded the land while Israel was weak. So they were burying a man that suddenly they spied a band of raiders and they put the man in the tomb of Elisha. You can see how weak the Israelite was, oppressed by nations. You can't even have a funeral, a burial, no. So they, put the man in the tomb. And the man was let down and touched the bones of Elisha, and he revived and stood on his feet. Verse 21. They simply put the dead man in the tomb of Elisha. And the man stood on his feet. What does it mean to us, this matter, this event? Is symbolize one thing. A house of Israel, the Israelites, will be thrown out. But by God's grace, the nation of Israel still have hope of revival, being revived. God will throw the house of Israel away. But the Lord's deliverance will come. They will have hope of salvation. As we read on verse 21 to 25, it's still the third paragraph, right? And Hazael, king of Syria, oppressed Israel all the days of Jehoahaz, but the Lord was gracious to them, had compassion on them, and regarded them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and would not yet destroy them or cast them from his presence. Verse 22 to 3. God was gracious to Israelites. Even in such a time, the Israelites, the house of Israel, was in darkness, in despair, in their own sin, in the sin of Jeroboam. But his grace was still there. They did not leave the sin of worshipping a golden calf, Yeah, they even worship Queen of Heaven. They were in judgment. They were weak. And yet God was still gracious to them. God was gracious to the house of David as well as the house of Israel. What is the heart of God? Oh, the house of God. The heart of God was soft. They were oppressed by king of Israel. Their nations was almost destroyed. But because of the covenants God had with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he was gracious to them, had compassion on them, and regarded them. God was still gracious to them, had compassion on them, and regarded them, would not yet destroy them or cast them from his presence. Verse 23. Not yet cast them from his presence. But they are in heavy sin already. God did not destroy them, did not cast them from his presence yet. But after casting them from his presence, God was still gracious to them. The body touched the bones of Elisha. He revived and stood on his feet. Here it says that God has not cast them from his presence. They were in heavy sins. God will cast them from his presence. But God had not yet done that. And in the future, when they were cast from his presence, God will still be gracious to them. Why would God be gracious to them? Because God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is faithful. His faithfulness lasts forever. As long as is the descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he will be gracious to them. Whether you are house of Judah or house of Israel, God will still be gracious. To us today, Whether you are in 611 or you are brothers and sisters attending other churches, God will still be gracious to you. As long as you believe in Jesus, you are God's children. God will be gracious to you. But whether you ask for such grace, however dark it is, maybe in your own church, in other churches, in the tradition, there will be darkness. Just like in the past, I was in the traditional church. I did not believe in the Holy Spirit. Yes, the Holy Spirit only exists in my brain, in my head knowledge, not in my heart. When I was in Vancouver, Adino told me that after a meeting, in the meeting, that someone was laid hand on, and then someone was slain in the spirit. I told him, do not go there again. It's a cult. Okay, and then say, okay, Adino say, no, I will not go again. Okay, we were so terrified of, we didn't know. So, I gossip, I badmouth them. So today I need to watch. But God, it was gracious to us. Today God sent me back to Hong Kong, 20 years. And God's work is mighty in our midst. God really was gracious, is gracious to every Christian. Even though you are in darkness, God still is gracious to you. I'll finish this story. God has not cast them from his presence because of the action of Elisha, right? Striking the ground 3 times. 3 times he will defeat Syria. Jehoahaz, the son of Jehoahaz, we capture from the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael, the cities which had taken out of the hand of Hazael by war. 3 times Joash defeated him, and we captured the cities of Israel. 2 fathers fought against each other. The northern kingdom defeated the southern kingdom. Now Elisha, took a prophetic act. The 2 sons were there. The sons of the southern kingdom defeated the northern kingdom 3 times. I hope you understand. God is gracious. The word of the prophet shall come true. Then this chapter ends. Yes, God is gracious. We read this chapter. To the people in captivity, they knew, even though they were in captivity, they were cast from the presence of God, just like the bone was thrown into the tomb of Elisha. The nations died. The nations perished. But as soon as they touched the salvation of God, the bones of Elisha, the Lord saves, the Lord delivers. The house of Israel shall be revived too. They will return. They will be revived. They can return. There is hope. Why did God give them such a hope? Because God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The heart of God does not want to throw them away, cast them out, but their sins was heavy. That's why he had to cast them out. But after God cast them out, what happened to the covenant of God with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? The covenant is still effective. God still remember. God still regard. As they are cast out, they plead, they humble themselves. they plead with God, God will bring them back. So to us today, to all people today, God is speaking to you. However dark the history is today, yeah, whatever our nation is like today, God can intervene. If you have been cast out by God, you have left your own place. You cannot dwell in safety. Pray. Pray. Let God intervene. God is gracious. God will continue to lead you. You must touch the salvation of God. God is gracious. Return. Believe God. Believe in God. God will intervene by His way, by His time, in His time. Do not be despair. Do not forsake God. Do not worship idols. Do not follow the world. Whenever you plead with God, you return to God, God will bless you. Even though in deep darkness, God still remembers that you are His children. God is gracious. Today, as we are here in Hong Kong, we continue to walk in the grace of God. We continue to hold fast to God. We turn to God. We overcome the northern kingdom. We overcome the southern kingdom. And in God's kingdom, whatever the world is going through, I tell you, in 611, it's like we're living in the second world. Like not the second world, it's like another world, okay. It's like a paradise to us. Because we experience God's kingdom, God's peace. Even though we are affected by COVID-19, but we are full of peace. Amen. May God bless us. That's the end of the message today.